Those of you who live in Northern California have seen this little graphic show up on the news. It shows ICU capacities. San Joaquin Valley, 0%, that's a little south of us. Southern California, 0%. The Bay Area, 9.2%. Greater Sacramento region, about 15%. And Northern California, 27%. The real question for a lot of this is, well, if I need to go to the hospital, if I have a heart attack, if I'm fighting cancer, if I have an adverse relationship with my medication, is there a bed for me? In many ways, that's the real fear because COVID is spreading. Now, this creates what sometimes is known as a commons. What does that mean? A commons is sort of a collective good that we all share. And the collective good that we're concerned about is healthcare. Now, a classic commons illustration is a fishery. Because often with a fishery, people will notice, well, there's a limited number of fish in this fishery. And if you have so many fishing boats, they can go out and they can exhaust the fishery and the fishery can collapse. And so what they usually do to manage a fishery is everyone has a quota. The difficulty is that quotas are difficult to regulate. And that, well, especially if, let's say, this year it's not a particularly good year in the fishery and there's not enough clams or lobster or salmon or tuna or something, well, there might not be enough to go around, and so there's a big incentive for people to cheat. The problem is that you think, well, I'm just going to take a little more because everybody's doing it, but then the fishery collapses. And there are, in fact, many crises of commons right now in our world. The oceans. I was just talking to my family about the Passaic River. The Passaic River is the river that runs through Paterson, New Jersey, where I grew up. And we were seeing some pictures of waterfalls with beautiful ice and crystal blue water, and I commented that New Jersey has this beautiful river, the Passaic River. It's a gorgeous river. It's got one of the highest waterfalls on the East Coast. And when we go there as a kid to look at the ice and the beauty of that waterfall in the winter, the water is all brown. And when you go back home after visiting the falls, there is this smell on you. Because especially during the Second World War, all the chemical industry in New Jersey, they would just dump their waste into the Passaic River. And even today, they're trying to clean it up because it's a beautiful river. But it's very difficult. And so that river, in a sense, is a commons. And, well, does anybody own it? Well, not really. And the oceans are like that. And if the Chinese are putting a bunch of stuff up into the atmosphere, guess what? Floats over to California. We all share elements of the planet, and, well, we all have to take care of it. Is the Amazon rainforest a commons? Well, Brazil and Ecuador and Peru and a number of those countries, it's within their countries, but if the forest gets cut down, what does that do to climate? Well, I don't know that we know. I watched a video this week and commented on it of a guy named Jordan Hall, and basic part of his video we talked about normativity with respect to the commons. Now, normativity between us is we have these norms back and forth that we sort of hold each other accountable. If someone is mean to me, I might turn away from them or befriend them or something. We have all these little subtle interrelationships that we sort of hold each other in check. There's also laws. Laws are very formal, and well, if you drive too fast, or if you make too much noise, or if you do something that sort of hurts other people, then the state can get after you. And then he talked about something that he's using a word, deep code, which is sort of a new way of getting really about commons. Like you can't just keep pouring chemicals into the Passaic River and not have it be fouled. It's not really a matter of law, although there are laws around it. It's not really a matter of norms. It's really, deep code is something like natural law. If you foul your river, you'll have a fouled river. If you overfish your fishery, the fishery may collapse. But the thing is, today we're living in a society that is so built up from human structures and design. We're living in a very technological world. And so the word that often comes to the fore is responsibility. Now, commons are very old. If you go to Boston, Massachusetts, the church where my deceased sister and her husband, my brother-in-law, and their children go to is Park Street Congregational. And Park Street Congregational, it's a very old, famous church. It's right on the Freedom Trail in Boston. And if you ask people where it is, they'll tell you it's right on the Boston Commons. You say, well, we don't use that word out here in California much. Well, what's the Commons? Well, that was a field. And what was the purpose of the field? If you had sheep, you could bring your field to the Commons and they would graze on it. Now, of course, if you had a massive flock and you brought them all there and you ate up all the grass in the Commons, some other people who had sheep would be a little annoyed. So that would be a norm. They'd say, hey, you overgrazed the Commons. The Commons is for all of us to share. And as long as there's not too many people, a common system works, but as things grow, well, they get stressed. A commons is not a collective that has a group of owners. A commons is not a cooperative that sort of establishes a corporation to work on behalf of members. A commons is owned by no one and can be owned by no one, such as no one can own the air, but I wouldn't imagine people are going to try. No one can own the oceans, but regulations try to get into it. Commons are owned by God. And for this reason, you have all of this code in the Old Testament, like God saying, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Well, what does that mean? It means he looks over everything. He is above all norms and he's above all laws. Judgment Day is something that's very common across culture and religious lines, that at the end of the world, the deity will do an assessment basically of how we treated the commons, how we treated each other. God is the owner, but secular societies where there is no God, well, you really set up the problems of the commons, because if there is a God and he owns the oceans, or he owns the river, or he owns the land, and if you mistreat the king's land, or the king's oceans, or the king's air, well, the king is going to have something to say. But secular society basically says there is no king. You see this in the 14th Psalm. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. Now, there weren't atheists back when the psalm writers wrote. Atheism is a fairly recent thing. What did the psalmist mean? He meant that God doesn't see when I foul the commons. They are corrupt. Their deeds are vile. There is no one who does good. The fisherman says, everybody cheats. The Lord looks down from heaven on all of mankind to see if there are any who understand, any who seek God. All have turned away. All have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Do all these evildoers know nothing? They devour my people as though eating bread. Then they never call on the Lord. But there they are, overwhelmed with dread, for the Lord is present in the company of the righteous. The one fisherman who doesn't overfish, how do all the cheating fishermen feel about him? Oh, that do-gooder. Why do they resent him? They resent him for doing the right thing. You notice this pattern. You evildoers frustrate the plans of the poor. If someone has a large flock and they completely overgraze the commons, who suffers? Those with small flocks. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores his people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. This is what the cry of Isaiah was. Israel is a small nation, and there's Assyria and Babylon and Persia and Greece and Rome and Egypt, and Israel can't find her way in the world. Israel is small and has suffered. She tried to cheat like everyone else, but couldn't compete with the big empires. So then she cries out, "Where is the God of justice?" Christmas Eve, and I noticed this in "O Come All Ye Faithful," citizens of heaven, that is an attempt to communicate something, but it gets the wrong message. When the heavenly host comes on Christmas Eve, and they the army comes, but the army sings. And you think, why are the hosts of heaven singing and not warring? Well, because the prince has come. Well, did he come descending on a chariot of fire? Did he come killing Romans and persecuting Herod? Why would Herod kill the boy babies of Bethlehem? Because he's a threat. But this king comes born of a virgin. Now, in Luke 2, 22 to 24, we get Jesus' dedication at the temple. And this has become such a ritual around us that we don't even understand its roots. What are its roots? Well, it's actually connected to a lot of things. Back in the day, during, let's say, World War II, or you can find videos of when they would launch a ship, they would take a bottle of champagne and they would smash it against the ship. And they would call it a christening. In the Roman Catholic Church, infant baptism is a christening. In Baptist churches, they don't like infant baptism, so they have dedication. But what are we talking about with this? Because it's actually clearest with infant baptism, because baptism, as I often remind you, is a ceremonial drowning. Now, we don't actually drown the baby, and we shouldn't. But all of these things are actually connected to very ancient traditions of sacrifice. Why do you burst a bottle of champagne against the ship? Because champagne is the most costly wine. You don't burst a bottle of water against the ship. If you would burst some $2 chuck against the ship, people would be offended because it's an insufficient sacrifice. When the time came for the purification rites required by the law, remember we have norms, we have law, then we have this deep code. Required by the law of Moses, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male is to be consecrated. Now that word has the word sacred right within it. Every firstborn is sacred. And what is sacred? Sacred is that which makes the commons work. Without the sacred, you have no commons. So you consecrate the firstborn male to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice of, for the poor, it could be 2 doves or 2 pigeons. Now, if we did this in church, people would be horrified. They bring the nice baby up, and everyone's so happy, and there's the baby, and he's cute. So, okay, where's the sacrifice? Well, then they bring a little bird cage, and here's 2 birds. What does the minister do to the bird? Does the minister pet? Oh, pretty bird, oh, pretty bird. What happens to the bird? It's broken. Our ceremonies are so mild. The death of the animal brings the point home that life is precious. And many have suffered, so this child can live. This, in fact, comes from Exodus 13. Consecrate to me every firstborn male. The firstborn offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me. Well, what would that mean? That would mean a sacrifice. How does it get to God? You put it on the altar, it turns to smoke, it goes up to heaven. That's how this all means, how this all works symbolically, whether human or animal. A little bit later in chapter 13. After the Lord brings you into the land of Canaan and gives it to you, as he promised on oath to you and your ancestors, you are to give over to the Lord the firstborn of every womb. All of the firstborn males of your livestock belong to the Lord. Redeem with a lamb every firstborn donkey. Now you might say, well, what's with that? A donkey was an unclean animal. You couldn't sacrifice the firstborn donkey. So what do? Well, you either offer a lamb in its place or you break its neck. And now we hear this and we think, this seems so dramatic. What we don't understand is what we're creating here is the commons. Redeem every firstborn from among your sons. Now, ceremonially, this gets managed by the tribe of Levi. In the days to come, when your sons ask you, what does this mean? Say to him, with a mighty hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed the firstborn of both people and animals in Egypt. This is why I sacrifice, see it's right there, if you follow the roots down, here it is. This is why I sacrifice to the Lord the first male offspring of every womb and redeem each of my firstborn sons. How did you get out of Egypt? Someone had to pay the price. Who paid the price? All the firstborn paid the price for Israel's freedom. Hence the ceremony. So Jesus and Joseph and Mary go to the temple. The price must be paid, even for Jesus. See, the crisis of commons is a crisis of atheism. Because, notice the language. Are you nobility, called Lord, or are you a commoner? Who are commoners? Commoners are dependent upon the commons. And if the commons are not maintained, if the commons are not respected, the poor suffer. The commons is the space where there is no poor among you. The commons is there, well, if there is no God to enforce, then all you have are cheats. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. When we find nothing sacred, well, when do we say, is nothing sacred? What deep code has been violated, and why have we basically feel that's okay? Now this continues. Now there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon, who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel. We were pretty happy the last couple of weeks because it wasn't overheating anymore. Rick and I are always working on these little technical things. And we have the sound through that camera. The other camera's working fine, but we can't get the sound to work through that camera yet. So that's the kind of stuff we're muddling with all the time. And so Simeon basically says, we've been waiting for the commons to be restored, for the balance of the earth to be set right. We've been waiting for the world to be set straight. Now I can die in peace. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts. When the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what the custom of the law required, notice how law functions within commons. Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of the nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and a glory for your people Israel. This is good news, not just for Jews, but Jews and Gentiles alike. As the child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him, then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother, this child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too. Christening always comes at a cost. It's a ritual sacrifice. There was also a prophet, Anna, the daughter of Peniel, of the tribe of Asher. She was very old and had lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage, and then was a widow until she was 84. She never left the temple, but worshipped night and day, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to God and said, and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Israel, of Jerusalem. See, here are all the patterns tied together. Then Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord. They returned to Galilee, to their own towns in Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong and was filled with wisdom, and the grace of the Lord was on him. But now notice, well, law is supposed to reinforce commons. It's supposed to happen automatically. Well, if you foul the river becomes foul. If everyone does what they're supposed to, everyone can use the river. But crises of commons are all over the place. And we have a COVID commons. Well, should I wear a mask? Shouldn't I wear the mask? What is responsible? We all noticed in this, well, if you clamp down too hard, people suffer because of the clamp down. If you don't clamp down hard enough, well, then hospitals get overrun. And, well, then the government starts to plead with you. Why? Because the government cannot have control over this, because norms have their place, laws have their place, but in the law of the commons, everyone sort of has to do what they're supposed to do. You try to stretch the law to do what it can't do, and you have a real problem. Our relationships with each other are stressed because we're trying to make norms, interpersonal relationships, perform beyond what they're able to do. And so then there's this deep code. Well, what is this deep code? This deep code is reality itself. And who governs reality itself? Well, the maker of reality. And if we don't practice the deep code, well, the strong take the weak. There is no God, and it's violated. This christening, notice the language, the christening, Christ is anointed one, anointed is tied to sacrifice. Christening points to Christ. An animal sacrifice is made temporarily for Jesus himself. This sacrifice points to the sacrifice Jesus himself will become. Jesus will be a holy sacrifice to restore the commons, one sacrifice for all, so that, well, when we baptize a child, do we butcher a chicken? No, and we're rather grateful for that. But notice how the Apostle Paul talks about the law. The law is something important, You need it there. But the Apostle Paul noticed the law is insufficient. The law can say, don't overfish. The law can say, don't pollute the river. The law can say, be careful with each other, make sacrifices now so the hospitals don't fill up. But the law can't do everything, and so law sort of creates this double bind. On one hand, we need it. On the other hand, it condemns us. Because the law can't get everything right. Should you drive 100 miles an hour on the highway? No. Are there times when maybe you need to? Yes. This is the problem with the law. The law is unable to do this. It is a stopgap, a measure that points to the final solution, and yet we are unable to keep the law. And the answer actually comes in a very common illustration in the book of Jeremiah. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will be like the covenant, it will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel. After that time, declares the Lord, I will put my law on their minds and write it on their hearts. Notice, that's where it goes. The law can't do this. It has to be written on the minds, written on the hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness, and I will remember their sins no more. Jesus is actually the resolution of the crisis of commons. You might say, well, how can that be? Because this law is on our hearts. It's the generosity of, I'm going to respect the river. I'm going to respect the field. I'm going to respect the air. I'm going to respect all of this. Language is another comment. I'm going to respect the language. I'm going to use it properly to bless and not to curse. Jesus changes us from the inside out to put us in alignment with the deep code. And this is how we can have freedom and responsibility. The deep code is known by all. The commons is shared responsibly and by all. The poor are no longer among you. The kingdom comes and his will is done on earth as it is in heaven. All of that shown by Mary and Joseph going to the temple with a couple of doves and saying, here he is. We make this sacrifice knowing he will be the sacrifice and the commons restored. Let's pray. Lord, we all want to live with neighbors who respect, neighbors who do the right thing. We all want the airwaves to be respected. We want the waters to be respected. We want our common space to be respected. We want the language to be respected. And we don't. And we feel the violation of the shalom between each other. It's in norms, it's in laws, but way down deep, it's in something more profound, more basic, more elemental, more natural. And Jesus comes and becomes the sacrifice for the world, the sacrifice that reestablishes the balance and the shalom and the code. Help us, Lord, to then become like him. When we are christened, may we become Christ-like. When we are sacrificial, may we become Christ-like. Help us, Lord, to believe and to trust. and to understand that, in fact, this work has already been done. It's been done for us. May we now live in obedience and grateful submission to it. Hear our prayer. In the name of Jesus, amen. Would you stand?